Welcome, everyone. My name is Matthew Monagle, and I'm the web manager here at Columbia Business School Executive Education. And thank you for joining today's executive webinar series entry with Dr. Heidi Grant Halverson. Dr. Halverson is going to be talking us through the growth mindset in our organizations. But before we get started, let's go through just a few housekeeping notes. First and foremost, I know the question that comes to the top of everyone's mind is, will you be able to revisit this presentation once it's over? We will have a full webinar recording of this available within about 3 to 5 business days. So go ahead and keep an eye out for that. We'll send it to you via email when it's ready. We encourage people to ask questions throughout the webinar as they come to mind. We are going to have about 10 minutes at the end for specifically 4 questions, but just to ensure that you don't forget them or that you try and remember them later on and you don't remember what it was, do be sure to send those in using the Q&A box in our application as soon as you think of them. And if you are a social media user, we would encourage you also to participate in the conversation on Twitter. You can use the CBS ExecEd hashtag. So Dr. Heidi Grant Halverson is a member here at Columbia Executive Education. Specifically for us, she teaches in our Leveraging Neuroscience to Power Organizational and Individual Performance course that runs June 14th to 16th. And I'm going to kick it over to her, and she's going to walk you through some of the information about a growth mindset. Heidi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. Just a quick word about myself. So I'm the Associate Director of the Motivation Science Center at Columbia University, and I'm also a Senior Scientist and Head of Product and Instructional Design for the Neuro Leadership Institute, which is an organization that provides consulting and training in the leadership space based on insights from psychological science and neuroscience. So today what I want to, in the time that we have, which I realize is not a lot of time, give you a sense of, why so many organizations are talking about growth mindset as an increasingly important part of their company culture. And really, as you'll see in a moment, there are a remarkable number of benefits to shifting your organization's culture toward growth mindset thinking. I'll talk a bit about what growth mindset is, what the benefits are, and what we're seeing in some organizations that are making growth mindset a big priority. But I think one of the most obvious ways in which growth mindset is beneficial in an organization is its ability to promote change agility. When we think about why it's so hard to be change agile, and a lot of the consulting that's done in organizations around change agility, a lot of the focus is often, and rightly so, on process, on how organizations can develop processes, ways of working that enable them to be more sensitive and responsive to change and more resilient in the face of change. But there's a really important psychological dimension to change agility as well. When we ask people to, try to be more flexible, to be more open to change, to seek opportunities in change, to be sort of less anxious, cling less to the status quo, be less risk averse. We're really asking them to overcome a significant psychological challenge that has everything to do with the way our brains represent information about change and fundamentally the way we're wired as human beings to avoid threat. There's an interesting fact that I think is really helpful when we try to understand risk aversion and change aversion. And that is that there's about 3 to 4 times as much real estate in your brain dedicated to detecting and anticipating threat as there is to detecting and anticipating reward. And that's because our brains evolved to keep us alive. And it's, detecting, if you miss the apple in the tree, that's a bummer. But if you miss the snake in the bushes, that's life-threatening, right? So we're oriented toward detecting threat, to weigh those things a great deal. That's where the loss aversion bias comes from, right? That we weigh risks more than rewards. And really change agility is wrapped up in these issues of how the brains work. When we represent change as a threat, there's a whole host of negative things that happen in the brain, as you'll see in a moment. And so what we want to try to figure out is how we can get people to represent change differently. And so therefore get a lot of that resilience and flexibility and lack of risk aversion and openness to change that we're looking for in employees in organizations today. Okay, so there's a little bit of a delay as I try to forward things. So there we go. So how do we experience change and difficulty? As I said, there's really 2 ways that we represents change in the brain, and that is either as a threat or as a challenge. When we represent change in the brain as a threat, the response that we get is the distress response, right? This is sort of normally how we think about stress in general, as distress, right? The negative form of stress. So there are a lot of physiological changes that happen. You get less oxygen flow to the brain. People's ability to focus becomes lessened, their ability to think deeply, working memory shrinks. And in general, you find that people are having kind of a fight or flight response in response to change when they see it as a threat. So they're less able to be flexible. They cling more to the status quo. They get bogged down in the details of a problem instead of focused on finding solutions. They have an increase in anxiety and dejection, and that anxiety derails their ability to perform. So a whole host of negative consequences. But we know, again, from about 30 years of research on how difficulty and change are represented in the brain, when people instead represent change as a challenge rather than a threat, you get a very different kind of stress response called the eustress response. Now, it is technically still a stress response, but its consequences are quite different. You actually get an increase in oxygen to the brain, increased blood flow. People are, when they're having a eustress response, preparing to take action. Sort of the best example, I think, of this is a professional athlete on the verge of a competition. It experiences eustress, right? It's a preparatory response for challenge rather than a fight or flight response to threat. And so we find when people have a eustress response, they're actually better able to think clearly. They're more focused on solutions. They have less of that negative emotion that is so derailing and more of a sense of openness and determination, right? So that's the goal here. We're trying to figure out how can we get people in the organization to see change as a challenge. And the answer is that the single best predictor we have of how people will see change is their mindset, whether they have more of a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. For those of you who aren't super familiar with the terms, a fixed mindset really stems from a desire. You can think of it as, seeing your goals and the work you do every day as about being good, right? Proving to yourself and to other people that you have a lot of ability, that you're competent, that you're in the right role. It's about demonstrating the skills that you have. You see the work you do is about demonstrating. And really importantly, there's a both conscious and unconscious focus on comparing yourself to other people, right? Because what does it mean to have a lot of ability? It means, having more ability than other people, right? What does it mean to be smart? It means smarter than other people. So the fixed mindset is about sort of proving that you're smart, proving that you're capable, and outperforming other people around you. And when people have a fixed mindset, they're much more likely to see change as a threat, because it is potentially something that can disrupt their ability to prove themselves. They might make mistakes. They might reveal weaknesses. In general, people who think in more of a fixed mindset terms tend to prefer what is known and what they know they're good at, so that they know that they can demonstrate their abilities. And they fear anything that might reveal a weakness or might reveal them to have lower ability than otherwise thought. The difference between, so a fixed mindset is about proving that you're smart. A growth mindset is actually about getting smarter. It's less about proving yourself and more about improving yourself, seeing the work you do every day as an opportunity to develop skills. And importantly, less concerned with how I'm doing relative to other people and more concerned with how I'm doing relative to how I did in the past with respect to this same skill or ability, right? So what I'm looking for is my rate of progress over time. Now, I want to say right now that everybody does both of these things, right? Everybody engages in more fixed mindset thinking where they're focused on proving themselves, and more growth mindset thinking where they're focused on developing themselves. What we're trying to do, and realistically, is not get rid of anyone ever being concerned with proving themselves. That's not realistic. But what we want to do in any organization, on any team, is increase the relative amount of time people spend thinking with a growth mindset, right? Thinking about the work they do is about developing and improving themselves. Because when they do, there are a whole host of positive things that occur from that. And most obviously, growth mindset is associated with seeing change as a challenge rather than as a threat. I want to give you one example from a study that came out of my lab, looking at how these mindsets can influence how we deal with setbacks. Just to give you a sense of the, growth mindset is one of those things that sounds a little too good to be true, sounds nice, but maybe isn't necessary. What the data is telling us is that actually there are really profound benefits for performance when individuals and teams and companies adopt a growth mindset. So here's one study. What we did here, this was done with Columbia undergraduates. We brought them into the laboratory, gave them a set of very difficult analytical reasoning problems to work on, and told half of the students that the point of the study was that the questions really tapped into an important aspect of their intelligence, and that we would be comparing how well they did to other Columbia undergraduates. So here the point of what you're doing is to prove yourself, clearly, to prove that you have this ability. The other half of the students, we told, that these questions tapped into an important aspect of their intelligence that research showed could be developed over time with practice. So this was really an opportunity for them to develop this aspect of their intelligence. For them, they had a growth mindset about the same task. And then what we did, rather unkindly, was tell everyone after their first set of 10 problems that they had performed in the 26th percentile. Now, Columbia undergrads are a competitive group. Nobody was happy about getting told that they had performed in the 26th percentile. We measured how they felt, how the amount of negative feelings they had about that, how frustrated, anxious, dejected they felt. And then we gave them a second set of 10 problems. And what I'm showing you here is their performance on a second set of problems as a function of how upset they were about their original performance. What you can see on the horizontal, moving from left to right, is increasing upsetness, right? They're increasing bad feelings about that original failure feedback. And then on the vertical, we're looking at their performance on that second set of problems, controlling for their performance on the first set. So what you're seeing, if you look at the orange bar, is that the more upset someone was about their original failure when they had a fixed mindset, right? When they thought the point was to improve, the worse they do on the second set of problems. But the more upset someone is about their original failure feedback when they have a growth mindset, the better they do on the second set of problems. And this is a very typical finding for us when we look at growth mindset and its impact. It's not that when you have a growth mindset, you don't get upset when things go wrong. It's not that you're not disappointed and frustrated when you have a setback on a project or you don't reach an important goal. But what you do with those feelings is very different. With a growth mindset, then people feel anxious, frustrated, dejected. It acts as a kind of fuel to motivate them to do even better next time. So this is a really great example of the kind of resilience you can see that growth mindset can bring. And again, when you think about change in an organization, it's really important to think about how we can equip people to deal with the inevitable setbacks that will happen when there's significant change going on, the mistakes that will get made, the challenges they're going to have to face, the things that will be new or novel that will be difficult for them to deal with. How do we equip them to deal with that experience? Well, growth mindset is a wonderful way to equip them to deal with that experience, because it takes whatever negativity they do experience is going to actually help fuel their performance going forward. Hang on one second, I want to see what the next slide is. Very quickly, there's actually a neuroscience research that supports these ideas as well. For example, one study that was done at Columbia looked at people with a fixed and growth mindset chronically, people who sort of walk around with these mindsets about the work they do each day, and showed that when people made mistakes on a challenging trivia task, people with a fixed mindset had relatively more activity in the parts of the brain that generate negative emotion, and relatively less activity in the parts of the brain associated with long-term learning. So later on, when they had a surprise retest of this, and they had been told when they got an answer wrong what the correct answer was, when they had a surprise retest, the people with a fixed mindset were much less likely than those with a growth mindset to actually recall what the right answer was. Right? Because they had been so preoccupied by their negative emotion and had relatively little activity going on in long-term learning that they couldn't do the thing that we're constantly asking people to do, which is to learn from their mistakes. Right? People with a growth mindset can make mistakes, have relatively less negative emotion, and a lot more learning activity in the brain. So they're really benefiting when they make a mistake and are able to take those lessons forward. Okay, I'm mindful of the time, and there's so much great stuff to talk about with growth mindset. It's really hard to squeeze it into a small amount of time, and I hope some of you are asking questions as well. Very quickly, a whole host of benefits associated with growth mindset in the now 30 years of research on the topic. We know that growth mindset reliably predicts greater creativity and innovation, again, in part because people are more comfortable with risk and mistakes when they have a growth mindset, but also we know growth mindset is associated with deeper thinking, and that's also fueling some of that creativity and innovation. People are much more resilient, as I've shown you, with a growth mindset. They're better able to deal with setbacks. They persist longer, and in fact, mindset is one of the strongest predictors of persistence in the face of challenge, which many of you, if you're familiar with Angela Duckworth's book Grit, know is a major predictor of success in just about any field. Taken all together, these things result in consistently superior performance across a wide variety of tasks and domains in the workplace, in the classroom, on the playing field. And not surprisingly, people with a growth mindset experience significantly greater well-being. They have a greater life satisfaction and superior physical and psychological health. So a whole host of benefits for individuals who can adopt and maintain a growth mindset in the workplace. And in terms of organizations, we now know, because there was a wonderful study done by Carol Dweck, who was my advisor. She's at Stanford now. She was at Columbia for years. And Carol Dweck, in collaboration with Sendelany Consulting, did a study looking at Fortune 1500 companies and looking at those that had an organizational growth mindset or a culture of development versus those that had an organizational fixed mindset, or what you call the culture of genius, where people feel typically that they have to prove themselves, that only the superstars get development opportunities, versus a culture of growth where they believe that the company believes in their ability to develop, that development is supported, but at every level. And what she found was that there were a lot of really tangible benefits for an organization to develop, to incorporate growth mindset into their culture. So one fundamental benefit was trust. 47% higher agreement in growth mindset cultures with statements about having more trust in their company, and leading that leading directly to increased engagement as well. So employees in growth mindset companies were 34% more likely to feel a sense of ownership and commitment to the future of the company. They also saw some interesting results in terms of perceptions of supporting risk-taking and innovation. So again, growth mindset companies, people felt that sort of psychological safety to actually take risks and to innovate. Again, many companies sort of talk the talk about risk-taking and innovation. They ask their employees to do these things, but the reality is the employees don't really feel that they have the safety to do that within the organization, that if they make a mistake, they're going to be punished, right? That their risk-taking and innovation isn't supported. So growth mindset companies really do create this environment where people feel, yes, I can make mistakes in the service of trying to improve, trying to innovate, trying to move the company forward. So lots and lots of benefits beyond change agility. And one thing I would just ask you to think about as after sort of processing everything I just said was, where do you think you see fixed and growth mindset thinking happening in your organization? And because I think what you'll find is that it'll map very closely to where do I see innovation in my organization? Where do I see, top performance in my organization? Where do I see real resilience? People thriving through change. It's going to really map to these ideas. And another thing to think about is also both, and some of in the consulting work that I do, and some of the training that we do, we're really focused on thinking about both what processes do we have in place, what practices do we have in place in the organization that are supporting growth mindset? Because you want to have as many of those as possible, right? You want to have people thinking about how to give feedback, how to use language to set goals in ways that create more growth mindset thinking. How can leaders in the organization be role modeling growth mindset publicly, sharing stories of their learning, sharing stories of their mistakes and what they learned from them. But you also want to be thinking about, what do we have here that's getting in the way of growth mindset? because that can also be a big problem. So, frankly, many performance management systems have aspects to them that make it quite difficult to have a growth mindset. Interestingly, Microsoft is a company that is now very, very actively pursuing growth mindset as a big part of its culture, but for years had practices in place like stack ranking, where you're basically forcing people to be competitive with one another, to silo and hoard information because only a handful of people can be the very best. That created a culture of fixed mindset thinking that many people think was responsible in part for a lack of innovation at that company during that time. So it's useful to think about, what are the practices we have here that might actually be getting in the way of people having growth mindset, because we're evaluating people in ways that actually suggest fixed mindset thinking. What is our philosophy around development? Does everyone get development opportunities, or is it only for a handful? These are the practices that sometimes can make it very difficult for people to have a growth mindset. So I think shifting a culture is really about, what practices do we add to support that better mindset, and where can we find things that we can, potentially get rid of or alter so that they don't really stand in the way of growth mindset thinking. So I'll stop there, and Matthew, ask if any questions have come in so far.
Thank you so much, Heidi. We've got a lot of questions actually that have come in, and the first one I'm actually going to take because I know the answer. A few people ask about the presentation. We will have a full recording of today's talk available in a few business days, so keep an eye out from that. We'll post it on our social media channels, and we'll also send it to all the participants via email as well. So let's dive into some of the questions that I can't handle. And the first one, the most overwhelming question across the board, seems to be, I like this research, I understand its application. Where is a good point for me to start? Is there a book? Is there an article? Is there some bit of research that I can use as sort of a jumping off point to implement this in our organization? What kind of recommendations do you have for them?
There are a number of, so there's a number of places. I think a good place to start might be looking at some of the things that are just sort of readily available online. Carol, if you go to HBR, the Harvard Business Review website, Carol Dweck has written a few pieces there that are really interesting about growth mindset. I myself actually have a couple of books, Succeed and 9 Things Successful People Do Differently, that have big sections on growth mindset, and I've written a bunch about it. So you can just sort of Google those things, get some more background on growth mindset's impact on individuals and on organizations. Carol Dweck also wrote a really great book called Mindset. That book is primarily focused on individual mindset, and her emphasis, a lot of her research is on schools. So for those of you who are parents, that might be actually a very interesting starting place for you, but it's less focused on the organizational impact as some of these other things. And then, obviously growth mindset is going to be a part of the topic that I'm talking about in June. Columbia Executive Ed, I do a lot of work, longer sessions on growth mindset and thinking about how to bring some of these practices in. And the other organization that I work with, Neuroleadership, we do a lot of work at the organizational level on growth mindset and helping companies develop that culture and training around sort of what are the habits that people need to develop in order to adopt a growth mindset, again, for themselves and as leaders. But I would say start with looking a little bit about what's available online to get a little bit more familiar with the research and the ideas. And then if you're interested in going further, I think that there's lots of ways to get, to partner with different people, myself included, who can, talk to you a bit more about the specifics of, every organization is different. And so you think about, again, to do that analysis of where in our company culture are we doing things that are standing in the way of growth mindset thinking? What can we do to introduce some additional practices that are going to really support growth mindset thinking? And looking at some best practices now that we have from companies like Microsoft that are really, Cigna is another company that has really tried to shift its culture toward growth mindset and kind of look at what some of those companies are doing and some of the innovations they're doing around mindset.
So we also had a few more questions, specifically about, people have, as you said, there's a lot of different organizations, a lot of different challenges people face, but someone had brought up a point about working maybe in more of a sales position or working with vendors where there's an element of competition in how you succeed. And so it's very easy to get kind of trapped in that fixed mindset. Are there certain situations where it's just better to just stay in the fixed mindset, or is everything an opportunity for growth?
It's a great question. So let me clarify, I think, something that's important. Competition isn't necessarily antithetical to growth mindset. In fact, there's a lot of work being done, with Major League Sports, looking at how coaches are trying to instill more growth mindset thinking on their teams, and they're certainly in a very competitive, kind of industry. So competition is fine. It really is. When we say the things you have to look out for with competition are, first of all, competition within teams can be something that gets in the way of growth mindset thinking. So if you're competing against other organizations, other businesses, that's great. That can be very, very motivating. It's when competition happens within a team of individuals that need to work together in some significant way, that can erode growth mindset thinking on the team. So that's a thing we want to do relatively more collaboration and cooperation, relatively less competition within the team, in terms of mindset thinking. Now, having said that, I think that really competition in and of itself is really is neither good nor bad. It's really what do I conclude? What do I think when I don't win? And that's really where growth mindset becomes very, very helpful. So people who are competitive but have a growth mindset, when they don't win, they don't think, well, I guess I don't have the ability. I guess I don't have what it takes. They say, okay, I did not win. I really wanted to. What can I do to improve, to develop, to do better next time so I win next time, right? And that's really how coaches are using growth mindset thinking on teams, right? It's about how do I think about what I do? And am I thinking about it as always opportunities for continuous improvement? Right. And that's what growth mindset culture is. So competition can exist within a growth mindset culture and be fine, as long as we always think about competition as something that's motivating us. But if we don't win, then we get right back up again and figure out how I can continuously improve. I do think that the answer to the question, is it ever better to have a fixed mindset, is very simple. There are actually is an extremely narrow situation in which fixed mindset thinking does seem to be, very motivating and not particularly harmful. And that is when the nature of the work you do is highly repetitive, very familiar, not particularly complex. So something that you sort of know like the back of your hand, and there's really no change or challenge or, kind of things being thrown at you, right? So if that's the nature of the work you do, then having a fixed mindset is fine. But enter in any source of difficulty, complexity, anything that's unfamiliar, anything that constitutes a change, and that's when you see tremendous advantages to having more of a growth mindset. In this day and age, there's really not that many people who could probably say the nature of the work that they do doesn't involve change, challenge, complexity, or or anything unfamiliar. So I say overwhelmingly, growth mindset is by far the better mindset to have, given the nature of the world of work today.
So we're just about out of time. I'm going to actually sneak in one more question because
Sure.
I want to hit on it. But for those of you that didn't have your question answered, just to let you know, we will forward all of these over to Heidi at the end of the webinar, so she'll have an opportunity to look through them. A lot of them will be addressed during the program, but like our faculty, sometimes these things find their way into research. They find their way into social
Absolutely.
posts, like that. So don't worry, we'll circle back. But the last question I want to hit on is about working across country boundaries, working across age boundaries. People have been asking about, international corporations where you're dealing with different cultures that have different norms, or different age groups, millennials all the way up to baby boomers and everything in between. Do you need to drill down? Do you need to adjust the growth mindset approach differently for each of these different populations? Do you need to get into the cultural specifics of each group?
It's a really great question. The short form is that what we know, looking cross-culturally and at different age groups, is that growth mindset seems to work the same way. So in other words, the benefits of growth mindset are the benefits of growth mindset cross-culturally. Now, there will be some subtle differences in what growth mindset looks like and what some of the challenges are to creating growth mindset. So, for example, in East Asia, so starting with the U.S., in U.S., there's a dominant set of beliefs around of success, and they're often implicit, that people that being successful is about having innate ability, right? We tend to use words like genius all the time to describe why someone was so successful. And in a culture where the dominant belief about success is that it is the product of innate ability, that's a real challenge for growth mindset, right? Because you really need to sort of get people away from this false, frankly, belief that success is about innate ability and help them to understand that actually intelligence and all abilities are things that grow and develop over time with experience. So you're tackling that part of it. That's what's hard here. If you go to East Asia, you find that in general, and again, these are generalizations, but in general, people don't tend to ascribe success to innate ability. There are much more effort. Their explanations have much more to do with effort. So that part of it is easier, right? You're not having to convince people, oh, anybody can improve. They actually believe that people can improve. That's part of their belief set around the nature of success. But in those cultures, you sometimes have other kinds of issues that are brought in. People having a real sense of responsibility to others around them, right? So if I make a mistake, if I'm not successful, then I bring, then I'm going to negatively impact my group, my team, my family, right? I'm going to bring shame onto others. And that kind of thinking can stand in the way of growth mindset. So I'd say that what we find generally is that growth mindset is growth mindset in terms of its impact and what it looks like cross-culturally, but the challenges are different. So different organizations, and I would say this is true probably in different industries, it's going to be, even within a culture, and it's going to be different certainly cross-culturally. The challenges of getting to a growth mindset may vary a little bit from place to place. With age, I would say that broadly speaking, there's a tendency for younger people to have more of a growth mindset, and that's a function of with increasing responsibility to others, people tend to lose a little bit of their growth mindset, right? Because they do feel, more eyes are on them, they have a greater responsibility, they can't afford to make mistakes, and that leads to more fixed mindset thinking. So broadly speaking, tendency for younger people in positions that have less responsibility to have more of a growth mindset. That said, that's not so much a generational difference, as it's not about millennials and baby boomers, as it is just about age. And about role within the organization. As you see people's responsibility level go up, you tend to see them feel that they don't have the psychological safety to have a growth mindset because they can't afford to make mistakes. And I think that's a real problem in organizations, because often it's people in leadership positions that we really need to have a growth mindset in order to do their best work. So that's an additional challenge I think that most organizations will be facing.
Great. Well, Heidi, I want to say thank you so much. This has been a
Sure.
really engaging session. As a reminder to everyone, Heidi is going to be teaching in the Leveraging Neuroscience to Power Organizational and Individual Performance program here at Columbia Exec Ed. We'll be having that course from June 14th to June 16th here on campus. And one last thing before we leave, we just want to give you a quick look at some of the upcoming webinars. You guys have been amazing in supporting these and turning out for them and asking some really great questions. So as a return, we're trying to schedule them regularly and get you some advance notice. So we'll be sending out emails for these, but this is just a quick look at some of the faculty that will be speaking in the weeks to come. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. So Heidi, again, thank you. We've had a lot of great feedback.
Thanks so much.
And for those of you that didn't have your questions answered, we'll promise we'll try and get to them later on. Keep an eye out at Exec Ed. We're going to try and get some of those on social media as well. So thank you, Heidi.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.